Something shifted this week that most analysts are still refusing to say out loud. The world's most powerful military alliance, the one between Washington and Tel Aviv, is visibly cracking, not behind closed doors, not in leaked memos, in public, on the record. And the implications of that crack are far bigger than any single missile strike, any ceasefire announcement, or any carefully worded statement from the Oval Office. Let me tell you what is actually happening. On February 28th of this year, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran with the stated objective of eliminating Tehran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and this is the part that should make every serious observer pause, forcing regime change. Think about that for a moment. A sitting American president, one who spent years mocking the neoconservative foreign policy establishment, one who ran on a platform of ending endless wars, just ordered the United States military into a regime change operation against one of the most strategically positioned nations on earth. Trump himself had stood in front of regional leaders just months earlier during a Middle East visit and declared that nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built. And yet, here we are. The question you should be sitting with right now is, who changed his mind and why? Because there is a critical realization embedded in this entire situation that I want you to hold on to as we go deeper. It is not about Iran's nuclear program. It never was. I will come back to this in the final part of what I'm about to share with you, and when I do, I think it will reframe everything you've been watching unfold over the past several months. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at what happened the moment those first bombs fell in late February. The first day of the war saw Iran fire missiles against bases and cities across the Middle East that host U.S. troops and assets in retaliation for the joint strikes, plunging the entire region into chaos. Iran did not hesitate. Iran did not blink. And contrary to what was being broadcast on mainstream networks in those opening hours, that Iran's military had been effectively neutralized, that its air defenses were shattered, that the regime was on the verge of collapse, the reality on the ground was rather different. Analysts noted that Tehran's attacks on U.S. bases had been more precise than U.S. officials were publicly characterizing, and in April, the Trump administration actually requested that the satellite imaging company Planet indefinitely withhold high-resolution visuals of Iran and the broader Middle East conflict zone. Let that sink in. The world's most transparent democracy asked a private satellite company to go dark over a war zone, not for a day, indefinitely. If everything was going as well as the press conferences suggested, why would you need to suppress the imagery? This is the part of the chessboard that never makes it into the evening news cycle. The board has multiple layers. The public layer is the one you see. The press conferences, the social media posts from the president, the statements from defense ministers. But underneath that public board is a second one, and on that second board, the real moves are happening. And right now, the most significant move on that second board is not Iran versus America. It is America versus its own alliance partner. It is Trump versus Netanyahu. And that fracture, if it deepens, changes the entire geopolitical calculation for the next decade. Since a ceasefire took effect in April, Trump has reportedly focused on securing a diplomatic arrangement that could prevent the conflict from escalating further, while Netanyahu has repeatedly expressed doubts about Iran's willingness to honor any agreement and has advocated maintaining military pressure. Now, on the surface, this looks like two allies having a reasonable policy disagreement. But context changes everything. Trump confirmed in an interview that he had told Netanyahu during a phone call, quote, "You're crazy, you'd be in prison if not for me." These are not the words of a harmonious partnership. These are the words of a patron who is beginning to feel used. And that feeling, that specific feeling of a powerful patron realizing his client state has been steering him rather than the other way around, is one of the most dangerous dynamics in all of geopolitics. To understand why this matters, we have to look at the anatomy of this war from the very beginning. Ask yourself a simple question. Who benefited most from the February 28th strikes? Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations noted almost immediately that for Netanyahu, the joint campaign was another display of his close relationship with Trump, and that it would strengthen the Israeli leader politically, this being an election year in Israel. So at the moment the bombs were falling on Tehran, Netanyahu was simultaneously solving a domestic political problem. He was not just fighting a war, he was running a campaign, and the American military was, functionally, a campaign asset. Al Jazeera reported that analysts were openly saying Trump's Iran strikes benefited Israel, not the United States, noting that war with Iran contradicted Trump's own publicly stated criticism of regime change policies in the Middle East. This is a remarkable thing for analysts to say out loud during an active military operation. But they were right. And here is the deeper question I want you to sit with in the comments below. Do you believe that a president as transactional as Donald Trump would allow himself to be pulled into a regime change war without understanding at some level what he was doing? Or is the fracture we are seeing now evidence that he understood it too late? Because the events of June are telling a very different story than the triumphalist narrative of March. Iran targeted U.S. bases in Kuwait and Bahrain, as well as a vessel near the Strait of Hormuz, in response to ongoing U.S. attacks, and the Iranian Navy claimed to have targeted a U.S. Central Command facility, saying it was responsible for recent U.S. actions against Iran. Meanwhile, Trump was publicly suggesting that a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran remained in place despite the recent strikes and that negotiations had gone very well. This is the fog of a war that nobody wants to admit is still going on. Strikes are happening. Ceasefires are being declared. The same ceasefire is then violated and then redeclared. This is not the choreography of a decisive military victory. This is the choreography of a conflict that has run into the wall of strategic reality and does not know how to end. And then there is Lebanon. This is where the Netanyahu story becomes impossible to ignore. After Trump announced he had spoken with Hezbollah leadership and that Israel and Hezbollah would stop attacking each other, Netanyahu said the Israeli military would keep striking southern Lebanon as planned, and the Israeli defense minister denied there was a ceasefire in Lebanon at all. Trump announced a ceasefire. Netanyahu's government publicly contradicted it within hours on a live international stage. That does not happen between allies who are operating from the same strategic playbook. That happens when one party has decided the other's objectives are secondary to their own. Analyst Negar Mortazavi made the argument directly on Democracy Now!, saying that Netanyahu was using continued attacks on southern Lebanon specifically to force Trump's hand on Iran, because Hezbollah's situation was directly tied to whether Iran would continue negotiations with the United States. This is the maneuver of someone who does not want the war to end on terms that leave Iran intact and capable. And from Netanyahu's perspective, the logic is coldly rational. A negotiated settlement that leaves Iran's regime in place, even a weakened one, is a settlement that eventually unravels. The only outcome he is willing to accept is permanent incapacitation. But that outcome requires America to keep fighting, and America under this president is starting to want out. Here is where the economics enter the picture, because they always do. Trump said the U.S. blockade of Iran's ports was the most powerful thing the U.S. had done, suggesting it had given Washington more leverage over Iran than military strikes alone. That is a president who is pivoting from kinetic war to economic war. That is a president who is looking for an exit ramp that he can dress up as a victory. Because the deal he wants, Iran agreeing to inspections, agreeing to verifiable limits on its nuclear program, agreeing to allow American personnel on its soil, is a deal that looks like American dominance without requiring American soldiers to die for it indefinitely. Trump told reporters that Tehran had agreed to allow the U.S. into Iran to recover buried nuclear material. If that holds, Trump gets to declare a historic achievement. He gets to say he did what no president before him could do. He gets his legacy moment. But Netanyahu gets none of that. A living, negotiating Iran is a threat that persists. And so the question I want you to think about and share your perspective on below is this. Is Netanyahu's continued military pressure on Lebanon and his public contradiction of Trump's ceasefire announcements a sign of strategic recklessness? Or is it a calculated bet that America will eventually have no choice but to continue? Because if it is the latter, it is one of the most audacious gambles in the modern history of the Middle East. The satellite images story is worth dwelling on longer than most commentators have. The Trump administration's request in April that Planet withhold high-resolution visuals of Iran and the broader conflict zone came as analysts were noting that Tehran's attacks on U.S. bases had been more precise than officials were publicly characterizing. We are talking about a commercial satellite company being asked to suppress imagery of an active war. This is what information management looks like in the 21st century. It is not the kind of censorship we imagine when we think of authoritarian states, the blunt, obvious blackout. It is the quiet phone call, the polite request, the indefinite withholding. And the reason it works is that most of the public never asks why the imagery stopped appearing. They just stop seeing it, and they assume there is nothing to see. What was there to see? We do not know for certain, but we can reason about it. If the damage to U.S. bases was consistent with what officials were describing, minor, manageable, well within acceptable parameters, There would be no strategic reason to suppress the visuals. Transparency would actually serve the narrative. The decision to suppress suggests that the visual reality was inconsistent with the verbal narrative. That is not speculation, that is the logic of information control. And it is the kind of logic that a high-intellect audience watching this video should not let pass without interrogation. Let me bring you to the critical realization I promised at the beginning, because now you have enough context to fully absorb it. This war was never primarily about Iran's nuclear program. If it were, the February 28th strikes would have been followed by an immediate and unconditional ceasefire the moment Iran's nuclear facilities were degraded. There would have been no ongoing strikes, no re-escalation in June, no Iranian targeting of Kuwait and Bahrain, no Strait of Hormuz confrontations, no satellite suppression, no Trump-Netanyahu phone calls escalating to expletive-laden arguments. A surgical strike with a defined, limited objective has a clean ending. What we are watching does not have a clean ending because the objective was never surgical. The objective, and this is where the chessboard reveals its deeper geometry, was a fundamental reshaping of the Middle East's balance of power. The elimination of Iran as a regional force capable of projecting influence through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, through Iraqi militias, through the entirety of what analysts call the axis of resistance. The nuclear program was the marketing ploy. It was the thing you put on the poster to make the war legible to the American public. Because we are attacking Iran to remove its capacity to support regional militias that challenge Israeli security does not fit on a bumper sticker. Iran nuclear threat does. The CFR noted that the stated objective of the February strikes was not merely to degrade nuclear weapons sites or hit missile launches, but to force regime change. That is not a limited military objective. That is a total war objective. And total war objectives do not get achieved in 12 days of airstrikes, however precise. History has taught us this repeatedly. You can destroy a regime's hardware, you cannot destroy its will, its identity, or its capacity to reconstitute itself in weeks. And the Iranian state, whatever one thinks of its governance, is not a fragile construct. It is a civilization that has been navigating existential pressures for 3,000 years. Netanyahu discussed the possibility of another round of strikes against Iran with Trump during their meeting, arguing that more strikes might be necessary to prevent Tehran from rebuilding its capabilities. This is the endlessness built into the logic of the strategy, because if the objective is permanent incapacitation of a sovereign state, not degradation, not deterrence, but permanent incapacitation, then every ceasefire is temporary, every negotiation is a pause, and every rebuilding effort is grounds for re-escalation. The war becomes self-perpetuating, and the only party that benefits from a self-perpetuating war is the party for whom the war itself is the political product. Which brings us to the final question I want to put to you directly. Trump made a deal with Iran on nuclear inspections. Trump brokered a Hezbollah ceasefire. Trump told Netanyahu, in so many words, that his escalation was unacceptable. Trump is pivoting toward economics and diplomacy because that is where he sees his legacy. And Netanyahu is, by all available evidence, trying to prevent that pivot from happening. So here is what I want your honest, informed, analytical response to in the comments below. At this particular moment in history, who is actually setting American foreign policy in the Middle East? The elected president of the United States or the prime minister of a foreign nation who once told an audience openly that America is a thing you can move very easily? That question is not rhetorical. It is the question that the next 12 months are going to answer definitively. And the answer will determine not just the fate of Iran or Lebanon or the Strait of Hormuz, it will determine the credibility of American sovereignty as a concept. Because if a foreign leader can publicly contradict the president's ceasefire announcements, continue military operations the president has told him to stop, and lobby actively against the diplomatic deal the president is trying to close, and face no meaningful consequence, then the word ally has been stretched so far from its original meaning that it describes something closer to the opposite. Watch this space. The chessboard is not frozen. The pieces are moving. And the most important move on it right now is not in Tehran or Beirut. It is in the relationship between two men who once called each other the closest of partners and who are now, on the record, calling each other something considerably less flattering. History, in my experience, tends to accelerate when the people running the war stop agreeing on why they started it.